Most people have little to no qualms of sharing their personal data with private companies, such that in the private sector, data is already a source of huge competitive advantage. Many established companies have been challenged by startups that have disrupted their industry by designing radical new business models using data collected. However, unlike the private sector, governments have no real competitors to provide the spur for change. The impetus must come from within. That impetus is now gathering momentum as there is increasing pressure for governments to modernize their service offerings. And in many instances, this involves their handling of citizens' data. Still, citizens all over the world have been suspicious about governments' handling of their data. On the African continent, many already judge their public officials skeptically, wary of corruption, coercion, and inadequate care for ordinary people's physical, social, and economic welfare. Today, with the adoption of digital transformation, governments collect and hold more citizen information than ever before. Our distinguished panel today will discuss how governments can build their citizens' trust as regards the citizens' data they hold. And I'm honored to have Dr. Kate Gitau, who is now an independent consultant. Prior to this, Dr. Gitau held the position of the Chief Executive Officer at the ICT Authority, a state corporation under the Ministry of ICT in Kenya. Her aim is to achieve provision and regulation of ICT in the public sector, as well as promoting ICT capacity and stimulating the growth and development of the ICT sector. Karibu, Dr. Gitau. We have Dr. Abba joining us from Nigeria, who has vast experience in the public sector in both Nigeria and the United Kingdom. Dr. Abba is a country director of DAI, and DAI is an international development company that works with a wide range of clients, including national and local governments, bilateral and multilateral donors, private corporations, and philanthropies in over 100 countries. Dr. Abba is my fellow lawyer and a strong champion for electronic government. Daisy Amdanye is the Executive Director of the Community Advocacy and Awareness Trust, a governance, development, and women's rights enthusiast and practitioner with several years' experience working in the field. Daisy is also the coordinator of the National Women's Steering Committee, a platform which brings together individuals and organizations drawn from the national to the county level, working in women's political and economic emancipation to harness their collective voice onto one national platform. Daisy is a renowned and active citizen, a champion for good governance, and for women's full inclusion in governance and political processes. She is also an avid commentator on politics, constitutionalism, and development. And our fourth panelist is Mr. John Walubengo, who is an ICT lecturer at the Multimedia University of Kenya. John is also a consulting data protection officer at Ajua. Ajua is Africa's first integrated customer experience platform for businesses on the continent. Ajua bridges the gap between businesses and their customers. Ajua's technology integrates with businesses at the points that matter most to their customers to measure and optimize their customer experience. John also serves as a trustee at KC Tanat, which is a multi-stakeholder think tank for ICT policy and regulation. Welcome to the panel, ladies and gentlemen. Let's dive right into it. John, there is a high probability that an informed citizenry as to how their government uses their data will garner more trust in the process and thereby be more likely to share personal data with the government. This, in turn, will enhance the government service delivery as citizens' data analytics will enhance the government's ability to make services work for the people who use them, improve the government systems and processes, and support better government decisions. John, you were a member of the Kenya National Task Force on Data Protection, which was instrumental in the creation of our data protection legislation. What safeguards were incorporated in the legislation to secure citizens' data from government abuse? How effective have the government mechanisms been in sensitizing the public as regards their data rights and protections? Has enough been done? Do we need to do more? And how can we do more? Over to you, John.
Okay. Thank you so much, Museo. I think I want to beg that I switch off my video. I'm in a challenged internet place, and as you speak, I could hear the delay. So I think the video will go off, and then maybe the link will be better. What has the Act? I was privileged to serve on the Data Protection Task Force that put together the Act that is currently in place. What safeguards were incorporated in the legislation to secure citizen data from government abuse? I would say that the KE Data Protection Act was adopted from the global standards. We call it the global standard, which is basically the European Data Protection Standard, otherwise known as GDPR. We figured that we cannot reinvent the wheel. Europe has been dealing with data protection issues for the last 2 decades. So what we did is to benchmark with GDPR and basically adopt, I would say, 98% of it. And in that act, we have the general principles of data protection, which include fairness and lawfulness as to whoever is collecting personal data. This means that the issue of consent, you must really seek consent from your citizen when collecting data, unless, of course, there are other legal provisions that are also acceptable. For example, when you're collecting tax-related data, you really don't have a choice with regard to consent. But in broad terms, private enterprises must seek consent before they collect personal information. There's also the issue of transparency, and this cuts across public and private sector. As you collect personal data, the enterprise or the organizations must be honest and inform whoever they're collecting personal data from about what is it they're going to use or how they're going to process this personal data. There's also the principle of data minimization, which basically says that don't over-collect data. If you're collecting my data for purposes of maybe admitting me to your university, then you don't need to collect data that is not related to academic issues. So the principle of data minimization is also well provided for in the Act. There's the issue of storage limitation. If, for example, your customer left your organization 10, 15 years ago, what reason do you have for retaining their personal information? Especially in the light of the fact that they can choose that you delete that information. They have a right to be forgotten, as we popularly call it. There is also the principle of accuracy. Whoever is embarking on collecting personal information, the Act provides that they have to ensure that that information is correct. And I always share a personal experience where I say my ID card, my government ID card, got my date of birth wrongly. I was born in October. That should be 10 in terms of numerics, but the data clerk entered it as 01. So I was born in January from government records. And I never bothered to change that until now. As I approach retirement, I realized I will not earn salary for 10 months. So it's an issue that can affect your citizens if you keep the data wrongly. So the Act provides that entities must ensure that the citizenry can seek that the data that is not accurate is corrected within stipulated timeframes. Then the other principle is confidentiality and data security. The traditional IT-related stuff that remains, where the enterprise or the organization collecting data must provide for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Finally, the issue of accountability. Now we have a data commissioner. All enterprises, public and private, are accountable to the data commissioner. in terms of how they are collecting, processing, and storing personal information. So these are the broad principles of privacy. And from here, the Act gave citizens the right to consent, the right to transparency, the right to access that personal data that public and private sector are holding in trust. I think that's my overview on what the Act provides me. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And I can see that our Act does offer a lot of protections to our citizens, but how aware are our citizens about these rights? Have there been enough sensitization campaigns, or can we do more?
There hasn't been. I talked to the Data Commission, I think 3 months ago, and no, just after the budget was read, and she told me that they did not get the requested budgetary provisions. And so the program for public awareness for Wanjiku will be affected. So I can say without fear that there isn't much going on in terms of awareness. What are the rights for Wanjiku in this space? And that's a big problem, because organizations can only pull up their socks if Wanjiku is demanding. But if Wanjiku is, not empowered to demand her data rights, then it translates to entities collecting personal information relaxing in as far as, adhering to the provisions of the Data Protection Act is concerned. So a lot can be done, but unfortunately the budgetary provisions for that is not sufficient.
And I think that will go a long way in citizens garnering trust, because it's one thing to have laws in paper, but unless Wanjiku and Mwananchi knows about it, then they won't know that they're actually secured. And then even as you said, we borrowed heavily from the GDPR. Another area we may want to look at, earlier this month, the EU member states mandated a proposal to develop an EU Data Governance Act, which is part of a wider policy to give the EU a competitive edge in an increasingly data-driven economy. And this act would seek to set up solid mechanisms to facilitate the reuse of certain categories of protected public data, increase trust in data intermediation services, and promote data altruism in the EU. So maybe even us, since we seem to be borrowing from there, we can start looking at data governance, because the more we have out there and we educate people, then they will get trust. Thank you so much, John. Dr. Gitao, digital transformation was forcefully accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, when many governments had to adapt their service delivery models to their citizenry. By embracing the digital world, as albeit we were all social distancing, government delivery to its people could not be put on halt indefinitely. So even those slow to accept technology were forced to embrace it rapidly. This in turn has led to an upsurge of citizens' data in the digital domain. Dr. Gitao, with your vast experience in the public ICT sector, what strategies do governments in Africa need to put in place to modernize their service offering without compromising citizens' data and rights? What challenges are African governments faced with when implementing these strategies, and how can they overcome them? Dr. Gitao?
Thank you very much, Mobel. I hope everyone can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I want to say that my views are slightly different, and I think there's a great danger in Africa always being in a rush to adopt what we call global best practice, because every region is has a different context. We are developing. We don't yet have as much access to our resources as other regions do. And therefore, even though the right to privacy, the right to information are very important human rights, I think we need to contextualize. With a light touch, I think more Africans are suffering from the lack of right to be remembered rather than the right to be forgotten. So we need to remember that. Now, why are we giving data privacy? There's the good reasons. One, we don't want to intrude unnecessarily into people's lives. Secondly, we don't want this data to be used to discriminate against people or cause them to lose certain benefits to which they are due. These are real risks in today's world where data is being collected not just by governments, but continuously as people use social media and different types of systems. So I'm not trying to minimize the relevance of data privacy and data protection. However, we also know that people are hiding their data to facilitate criminal behavior, tax evasion, and other illegitimate purposes. The last thing I'll say is that it is clear that proper use of data can lead to better use of public services. However, let me answer your question as best as I can. Firstly, there's a lot of intellectual work that needs to be done, and that work will not be done if we continue just to copy what we see other parts of the world doing, regardless of how many years of experience they may have. It's important to learn from them, but also to take into account our local context. We need to think of our own internal data models and protocols to be adopted by governments. That means when we say that you should not collect more data than is necessary, that means you have to think about what data is necessary. And it is true that we were at times collecting too much data because we were photocopying forms designed in other jurisdictions and just having the same form being used in our own area without thinking about what data fields do we actually need for this purpose. So we need to start thinking as Africans and think, what do we need? And also, what is the protocol for the collection of this data? I have been very critical when, as a citizen, I have approached a registration process, whether it was voter registration or national registration, and I watched the behavior of the registration clerk as they collect data either manually or electronically. I usually, afterwards, I write a memo and I say this and that was being done, which is not going to lead to data security or protection of data. So again, we not only design the processes as that activity is carried out, but we also need the critique because it's only when people are in the field actually collecting data from citizens that you begin to notice that in areas which you may not have addressed, people are designing their own processes and procedures on the fly, and some of them are not secure. So it's not enough just to design. You must also supervise, respond, and plan. Correctness, transparency, confidentiality, and security are very important, and I think this has come out now that there's a court challenge to the Huduma number where Kenya was trying to give a more comprehensive ID. Of course, that is of great benefit to the citizen because the lack of identity or the lack of data when you approach the government for a public service can lead to a very diminished kind of experience and even exclusion. However, I do appreciate the need for government to always be able to show that as I collect your data, I'm able to secure it so that it does not become available for illegitimate purposes, and so that you are also protected for my use of that data for illegitimate purposes. However, my last point is that we must allow government to use data extensively for legitimate purposes, because this is one way in which we will fast track our development, and we must not put unnecessary barriers to the use of data by governments because we are behind. And we're not going to catch up if we always adopt practices that make it more expensive and more difficult for us to leapfrog and provide high-quality services to all our citizens. They have a right to be remembered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Getao. And I really love that even as we're borrowing from the West, we need to localize our strategies for Africa because we have our own unique elements here which we need to take into account. And yes, as soon as we can get citizens to trust that the government is using their data for the right reasons, that citizens' data is really important for data analytics, for government service delivery. Dr. Abba, you have vast experience working with public and private international clients implementing various projects in Nigeria. Nigeria's government is in the process of rolling out a digital identity system to enable easier access to public and private services. But like those and other digital IDs around the world, Nigeria's initiative has been dodged by privacy concerns, with citizens and rights groups saying the country lack of data protection leaves their personal information open to abuse. By October 2020, 6 years after the government launched a national electronic identity card, less than a quarter of Nigerians, 200 million people, had signed up for the national identification number, according to the agency overseeing the scheme. The communications minister has now issued a directive mandating citizens to link their mobile numbers to their identity numbers by the end of this month, or risk being blocked from accessing telecommunication services. From your perspective, what must the Nigerian government do to increase their citizens' trust, as evidently citizens are hesitant to share their data with the government? Dr. Abba?
Thank you, Ngutao. Let me start by saying that the issue of low trust, low citizens' trust in the use of government data is not unique to Nigeria or to Africa. Only 49% of Britons trust their government's use of data and the protection of their privacy. And what is even more interesting is that only 31% of people that work in government trust their own government's ability to protect their data. Now, the deadline that was given by the Minister for Communications for 31st October is actually the sixth time that the deadline has been extended. The initial deadline was in December 2020. So when thinking about what government must do, it's important that government does what it says it's going to do. If it says it's going to do something, then it should do it, because that's what builds the trust. However, in this particular case, it was probably right that government didn't do what it said it was going to do, because the initial deadline was actually issued right in the middle of the pandemic. And you had, thousands of people risking infections to go to enrollment centers to try and enroll. So in a way, we're relieved that government further extended the deadlines to 31st October 2021. But I think we mustn't jump to the conclusion that citizens are necessarily reticent when it comes to sharing their data with government. Government already holds a huge amount of data about citizens. We must also look at our usual problem in Africa, which is often one of project management and logistics design. So at the time that this first deadline was given for 31st December 2020, there were only very few enrollment sites available to citizens. So you have thousands of people who were actually willing to go and register, but found it very difficult to do so. The government has now allowed the private sector to be able to enroll citizens on its behalf. And we now have about 5,500 enrollment sites across the country. That has made it easier for people to just walk in. They don't have to have queued the whole day. They can get registered within 10 minutes of visiting an enrollment center. But in addition to what I've said about government doing what it says it should do, the issue of data protection legislation is very important, and John Walu had explained the key components of the legislation in Kenya. We in Nigeria are still working on passing our own data protection legislation through our National Assembly, through our legislature. And, that legislation will contain a number of the things that John had mentioned, including creating the Office of a Data Protection Commissioner. I think what has also been said by others is very important. Government needs to be transparent, not just about what it will do with the data when it collects it, but why it's collecting it and how it's collecting it. So citizens need to be fully aware of why the government is collecting the data, how the government is collecting the data, what the government is going to do with the data, and how to be sure that the data you submit to government doesn't end up being used to wrap barbecue meat, as has been the case in some places. There's also the need for government to ensure that it manages public perception about how it uses data, because citizens are naturally worried about a big brother syndrome. So government must put in deliberate effort to educate citizens about what it is doing and how it is doing it. It's also vitally important to make sure that public servants are aware of their responsibilities for the protection of citizens' data. Quite often in many African countries, a number of records are still in paper files, and where digitization has happened, government must ensure that only those that have the need to see and handle data are able to do so. So these to me are some of the key issues that we must pay attention to. The linking of the national identity numbers to mobile phone SIM cards has actually seen us add 15 million records in the last 1 year. In the 20 years or so that the National Identity Commission had existed, we only had about 45 million verified records. We now have 60 million, and that increase of 15 million records has happened between when we said we would link national identity numbers to mobile phone SIM cards over the last 1 year, because more people have mobile phones and people don't want to be cut off from it. But it's a partnership between government and citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abba. And also your point about logistics and rolling it out ties it into what Dr. Gitau had said about Africa developing strategies for Africa to take in our unique challenges, which they may not have in the developed world. But it's good to hear what's happening in Nigeria, and all the best with that. Daisy, your impressive history in Kenya for standing up for citizens' rights is highly commendable. So I'm going to throw my next question to you. Recently, as regards a proposed trade deal between Nairobi and Washington, a UN conference on trade development, a UNCTAD analyst, held, given the different degrees of digital development in the United States and Kenya, data flows between the two economies are most likely to enable global digital platforms in the United States access Kenyan data and harness them, while Kenyan companies may have more limited abilities to collect and monetize data generated in the US. Keeping this UNCTAD analysts in mind, my question is, data privacy advocates have been pushing for new controls, processes, and standards, as well as greater transparency about the way citizens' data is used by the government. Are their concerns valid? How, as citizens, can we compel the government to desist from enabling foreign nations to monetize unfairly from our data as citizens? Daisy?
Thank you, Mado, and thank you so much for bringing me into this conversation. Very, very interesting. It's a whole new world for me, and definitely one that I'm going to look more into. Very interesting. But I think by default, that monetization is already happening. And I think it has been said, I think Dr. Gitao mentioned it, in terms of not directly by the foreign nations, but big tech companies, Google, Facebook, WhatsApp. And because they've designed these unique and exciting applications that help people gather information, share information. I mean, you often wonder these days, how did we manage without Google? And it is for free, but not free per se, because they provide these services to us and allow us to interact with one another. But it also gives them the opportunity to gather huge amounts of data, which they have been able to monetize and have not only become extremely wealthy as companies, but also very powerful in how they use that data and control people with it. And one of the things that came to mind, when I was thinking about this question about the fears and whether they're valid, was the challenges such as what happened with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for which Facebook was very heavily fined. Our very own government was accused, though they denied it. But remember that one of the selling points of the Cambridge Analytica was their successful work in Kenya as a pitch to other clients, and it was specifically around elections and how our data was shared and was used to manipulate perceptions, and this by the governing party, no less. So you're talking about government, So looking at government behavior is also problematic. So of course the issue here is not really about that, but how does government stop unfair use and monetization of our data by the foreign nations? So one of the things is that Kenya really must come out clearly on how, as government, now Kenya government must come out clearly to say how they plan to protect the citizens' data from such exploitation. When you look at the U.S. government's approach to this trade deal, they're very, very clear about what they want and what they want and what's in it for them as the Americans, higher paying jobs in the U.S., being able to grow the economy, improving opportunities. But then they're looking at it as a model for Africa. So this is not a small thing. I mean, Kenya is setting a precedent for the rest of Africa and the integration agenda. Remember, there is the AFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area. And in it, they also speak about the goal of strengthening e-commerce and digital trade. And as African countries, Kenya and African countries, even though Kenya is, quite basically considered like a leader in the digital space in Africa, one of the leading nations, we know that Africa is still very, very far behind. So how Kenya negotiates this deal will set a tone for Africa, And given Anka really pointed out that the digitization in Kenya can be leveraged by the platforms that access information in Kenya as a means or to create a hub to be able to access data from the rest of Africa. So I mean, the concerns are huge. We're not just looking at Kenya. So in Kenya, already we have a few problems because we have a huge trust deficit with our government. And I think this trust deficit and a culture of impunity within government that does not abide by the rule of law, that is problematic. So government must move fast to act in a way that actually builds trust in its actions and intentions and follow the law and the constitution. And already we're not doing well. It was already mentioned, and we know that yesterday the court declared the Huduma number illegal for being in conflict with the Data Protection Act and for failing to conduct an impact assessment that would identify the risk and breaches, to privacy, loss of data, and to create safeguards that will protect Kenya's data, and to also safeguard against the possible disruption of service delivery to Kenyans who can be locked out of the system because many Kenyans still don't have identity cards. So our own government has failed its own standards as set in the enacted Data Protection Act. And this doesn't augur well for building trust, which is what is necessary for us to venture into this journey of data mining, which is part of this agreement within the American trade deal. We recall also in 2017, in the run-up to the election, there was this whole fiasco with identity cards, multiple Kenyans holding similar numbers, same numbers, you know. So what it shows is a carelessness within government in the manner they collect and record and store our data. And already, Mr. Walubengo has already said it can have negative implications. He's also not going to earn a salary for 10 months because his data was captured wrongly. So, and I would want to appreciate, Walubengo and the rest of the Kenyans and the people who were in that task force that worked to develop the Data Protection Act, because it's actually very comprehensive and it seeks to protect from exploitation, including by government itself, and foreigners. So looking at the clauses on the transfer of personal data outside Kenya is important. So a big thank you to Walubengo and the team. So for me, part of that building trust would involve the government actually being able to show us that as part of their American trade agreement deal, that they've actually conducted an impact assessment of the attendant risk, and they're able to show how they've sealed all the potential loopholes that can be exploited to the detriment of citizens, and also how it will work for the benefit of Kenyans, because Kenya as a country and Kenyans, because we cannot run away from it. That is the world that we are living in, and so they need to be able to assure Kenyans that not only will they uphold Kenyans' constitutional rights and entitlements regarding privacy and exploitation, but also assure them that they will keep their data safe and it will not be used unfairly against us to exploit us or to exploit, for the benefit of just a few. So for me, it's an advocacy issue. Clearly, it's an advocacy issue. And we must be vigilant. Technology, whether we like it or not, is the new growth frontier and is a driving force for the development, of different kinds of development. It offers huge opportunities, and so we cannot run away from it. And so we definitely must hold our government to account. So we expect that the government will share this impact assessment and tell us how they are addressing those risks and how they are securing us against exploitation. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy. And I don't think I can add anything more to that. Because I can see from our conversations, it's apparent African governments can build and sustain citizen trust, but they need to focus on 4 main areas: humanity, transparency, capability, and reliability. And with that, we've come to the end of our conversation this morning. And I want to thank my panelists for amazing, informative conversations all the way from Nigeria to here in Nairobi. Have a wonderful afternoon. And to the rest of the African continent watching this e-government summit, enjoy your rest of your afternoon. Thank you.